hear me? Yeah. Firstly, thanks for the introduction, Paul, and thanks for organising today. So, a bit about us, very briefly. So we're both solicitors, and we work for a company called FREETHS. FREETHS are a top 50 law firm, got 13 offices ranging from London to Glasgow and places between. We've got an office in Birmingham, Leicester, Nottingham. Hannah's based predominantly out of our Birmingham office. I'm based out of our Leicester office, and on weekends the Tamworth office, which is where my parents live.
So there is a little bit on the right-hand side of that slide there that gives an overview of what we actually cover. So whilst we're going to try and tailor our talk tonight to some particular aspects that we think might be interesting to you, I think there's probably quite a lot of that you should be considering just generally that we might not touch upon tonight. But things like wills, lasting powers of attorney, anything like trust advice, things like gifting and inheritance tax planning. We also cover estate administration, so when people pass away and they need their estates administering. So that all ties into what comes under the banner of the tax trusts and estates team that we work in. So there might be other aspects that we might be able to help you with, so if you want to grab us later and have a chat about anything like that, there's always, there might be lots of areas that we can be of service to you.
So we have 28 minutes, and being lawyers, we know how to be on the clock. And so your objective today is to talk very briefly about inheritance tax, briefly about the budget and some changes, and then we're going to go through 5 case studies. Either these are real life examples of clients we're working with, albeit we've had to change the names. And if you've got any questions, so I know we've got Q&A at the end, but please feel free to let us know. I'm happy to answer questions. If you want a copy of the slides, or to get any questions, please put it on the feedback sheet and we'll be able to contact you, if not today, next week, within the week. So, inheritance tax. I'm sure a lot of people know about inheritance tax. The very basics, each individual has an allowance of £325,000 and they also have a residential allowance of £175,000. So in simple terms, if you have an estate over £500,000, there'll be inheritance tax to pay. And not everybody qualifies for this residential allowance. It does depend on the value of your estate. If your estate is over £2 million, then the residential allowance does reduce. There are things that we can talk about that can be used to reduce inheritance tax. And the popular things which we'll talk about today are gifting out of income, and setting up trusts, and also having different types of investments. So I know our colleagues will later on talk about some financial planning and whether you might talk a bit about the inheritance tax investments.
Okay, so as Rahul mentioned, obviously there has been the recent budget, which I'm sure everyone's probably fairly well aware of. Some of the highlights from our perspective, which may or may not actually affect you, were the limitation on business property relief. So broadly, business property relief applies to certain types of assets, mostly things like shares in limited companies. Private limited companies would be tax-free. So there was lots of planning opportunities and temporarily still are lots of planning opportunities for people who were coming out of limited family businesses. But what the government have decided to do is limit it, so whereas you could have unlimited inheritance tax-free shares in a private limited company, that's now going to be capped at £1 million tax-free, and anything over and above that is going to get only a 50% relief, so an effective rate of 20% inheritance tax rather than 40% inheritance tax. So a little bit of relief there, but it's massively reduced the amount of planning opportunities for limited company shares, and lots of consideration of how we plan around that to come in the future as they go through the HMRC consultations. Agricultural property relief works in a similar way, so that would be a relief that up until the budget that would have been relieved 100% on agricultural assets, the agricultural value of land, so farmland, and now it's going to be limited to £1 million, and everything over and above that is going to get an effective rate of 20% inheritance tax on it. The pension pot used to be tax-free, so it was very easy, made our job very easy. We could say to people, pension pensions are outside of your estate for both planning purposes and inheritance tax purposes, but now they are going to bring those into the inheritance tax calculation. So if you add what we call your free estate, so what you actually own, to your pension pot, that's going to bring loads and loads of people now under the inheritance tax banner, whereas they might otherwise have been outside of inheritance tax completely. So there's huge changes. So yeah, that pretty much covers the key changes.
So, first case study. William wishes to buy a property with Kate. William has agreed to put in £100,000 deposit and Kate £50,000. William has asked his father, Charles, for a gift of £50,000. What are the considerations? Bank of mum and dad, very popular. So what should we be thinking? So this case here, which is very common, if we're looking from the parents' point of view, so Charles's point of view, what does Charles want to do? Is he going to gift the money? Or does he want to lend the money? Again, those are the considerations he has to do. Advantage of gifting, straightforward, outside of his estate after 7 years. Disadvantage, the fact he's made a gift. What if his estate becomes a lot smaller? He might have other children. Is that £50,000? Is it fair on the other children? What happens if his son and what happens if William and Kate fall out? What happens there? So again, they're type of things we'd decide. Also, when the property is purchased, now William is putting in a high deposit. So what they should be looking at are things called a declaration of trust. So any time that you've got a property being purchased and the deposit is the amount of deposit is different between the two purchasers, it's worth considering that document. It's amazing how many people don't have a declaration of trust. Now you can have a simple document where you're saying, I put 100k deposit in, you put £50,000 in, so when we sell the property, I'll get my 100 back, you get your 50 back, and we'll split the difference. That's a simple one, which is okay for some purposes. However, what happens with the mortgage, if there's a mortgage? Who makes payment of that? Who makes payment of the bills? What if one party is earning more than the other party, and they contribute more? What should happen then? So again, it's worth taking advice on declaration of trust. Also, what people don't realise, they're buying a house, what are the two certainties in life? Death and taxes. So what happens if somebody dies? Would they want the property to pass to the other person? Would they want it to pass to their parents? Would they want it to pass to the rest of the family? Usually when they're older in life and they've got children, it's probably easier to say where they want it to pass to. But if they're young, let's say in their early 20s, they don't have a family, who do they want it to pass to then? Another thing to think about is how the property is held. So it can either be held as joint tenants or tenants in common. So joint tenants means when one party dies, the property passes to the survivor. Tenants in common means when one party dies, their share falls in terms of their will. So it's become more and more common now, the bank of mum and dad. And actually also the bank of grandparents.
Okay, so we're keeping with William and Kate, who are now married and moving through their lives. William wishes to sell his rental property, which he used to live in whilst he was at university. There has been an increase in the value of £50,000 since he purchased it, and we're looking at what the potential capital gains tax considerations are that he might want to take into account. So I think there was a question prior to this evening about capital gains tax and what is incorporated in the calculation, specifically about if you put an extension on the property. So the base cost is what you take as your deduction. So you say, what's the market value when I sell this property? That will include the value of any extension. So the simple answer is yes, if you extend the property, that comes into the capital gains tax calculation, because you say, what is the market value on the day I sell? Then you can deduct the acquisition costs, the costs of sale, and then any costs of renovations and improvement. Then you get a it used to be a fairly generous allowance, but it's slowly been whittled away so that now individuals each get a £3,000 allowance to deduct off that, and then ultimately you then pay the capital gains tax at 24% on the residential property on anything at the bottom of that calculation. So there are some planning points in there. Obviously they're married. William and Kate each have a £3,000 allowance, so between them they have £6,000. At the moment William owns the property, but there's no capital gains tax between spouses, so William could choose to gift half of the property to Kate. They both sell the property and then they've got £6,000 worth of allowances to offset rather than the £3,000. They could also look at principal private residence relief. We know that William lived in the property for a period of time, so even though he's now potentially got somewhere else that he's living, which would be his main residence, there is a period of time where that was his main residence and he can claim that period of time for principal private residence relief and get an element of it capital gains tax free. The other thing to be really aware of is the 60 days up there at point 1. That capital gains tax now has to be reported and paid within 60 days of the sale going through, which isn't very long, especially when you've got other things going on, like what am I going to do with the money now, and why did I sell it, and what's happening on my next steps in life. But there is an online report that needs to be completed. It needs to be done. It's not that difficult because it's online. If you do a tax return, you also then need to report it on the following year's tax return, which does, create a bit of admin to do, because you've got this almost immediate requirement and then one far in the future that needs to be reported, but you can then report that you've already reported it online and get deduction for the tax already paid, but you still have those two obligations to report. The other thing to consider, not our area, and I know that we've got people who are going to come after us who can give you a lot more information, but there are options to look at in terms of what you then do with those investments, and there might be some capital gains tax reliefs that you can apply if you take some advice and take some planning points on board when you deal with the proceeds of sale.
Now, let's fast forward a few years. William and Kate got a son called George. You would have thought. As part of his inheritance tax planning, Charles wishes to give a property. And for these purposes, this would be one of his rental property to George. And George is 8 years old. George is at private school. So what are the considerations? First, it's a good idea. Charles has got a good estate. If he's happy that he can afford to live without the income from the property, look at gifting it. It's good inheritance tax planning. But the amount of people who we see who have already made gifts of properties to children, to other family members, without taking any capital gains tax advice is alarming. Because from the land registry's point of view, all they need to do is a simple TR1, transfer the property from A to B. There's no mortgage, there's no land registry fee, because it's a straightforward gift. However, what about the capital gains tax? The amount of disclosures is alarming, and HMRC are actually looking at this quite strictly now. They're looking at the land registry to understand when properties are transferred out. So if anybody knows anyone who has gifted a property to someone and they haven't thought about capital gains tax, now's the time to do it. So in this scenario here, Charles will look at, okay, if I keep the property in my estate, it might be taxed at 40%. But if I gift it, then there'll be capital gains tax at 24%. So again, we might look at some of the planning opportunities as we mentioned before, but that's an option that you should be considering. And let's assume that he wants to gift it, the property outright to George. But George is only 8 years old. He can't hold a property. What he can do, he can say, from now on, I'm gifting this property to George, I'll keep the property in my name, and I'll hold it on trust on his behalf. Simple document called a bare trust. From that day onwards, the rent goes to George. However, Charles doesn't own the property, doesn't own the beneficial property, so he has to pay capital gains tax. On top of that, there's a new requirement that if the legal ownership of a property, so that's basically who's on the title, is different to the beneficial ownership, and that's who's entitled to the rent, who's entitled to the sale proceeds. If they're different, then this is called a trust, and the property needs to be registered with the Trust Registration Service. So again, now at the moment there are no penalties currently, so a lot of people own properties and the beneficial owners are different, but the rule is that you must register the property under TRS. But in this scenario here, Charles has done the calculation. He says, I don't want to pay the capital gains tax because I'm gifting the property and I'm going to have to pay money to the taxman. So what else can I do? And this is where the use of trusts can come in. So in trusts, what are some common language? Well, settlor is somebody who sets up the trust. So this case would be Charles. The trustees, well, they would be the people who own the property, like the landlords. So this could be Charles, it could be William and Kate. Charles can decide. And then you've got the beneficiaries. That's the person or the class of people who want to potentially benefit. So what are the advantages of trusts? Well, the advantage of a trust is the asset is outside of the estate of Charles after 7 years for tax purposes. Also, the asset's not in George's estate, it's not in Charles' estate, it's in nobody's estate, it's in its own entity. And therefore, after 7 years, it's not subject to any inheritance tax by anyone. It's also protected if it's in a trust, because whoever benefits from it, doesn't matter if they get divorced, they get bankruptcy, the asset is protected. The other advantage is if it's in a trust, when Charles puts it in there, he can elect to hold over the gain, which means he doesn't pay any capital gains tax. So you've got the magic, the property is now in the trust, doesn't pay any capital gains tax. After 7 years, it's outside of his estate. Now the disadvantage of trusts, there always has to be something, is the income tax rates. Because there's a high rate of income tax on any rent. Now here, he wants to leave the he wants the income to go to George. But George is 8 years old. He's not got a paper round, he's not getting any income. So in this scenario here, George could potentially have the rent, and it's tax-free. So, what's Charles' considerations? Well, firstly, is there a mortgage? If there is a mortgage, and he transfers a property into a trust, well, first he won't be able to legally do that because the mortgage has a charge on the property. But if he tries to do some kind of declaration of trust or bear trust documents, then there'll be stamp duty. So again, we see a lot of people who have got a property that they own, and there's a mortgage outstanding, they've signed a document saying, I've gifted 20% of my property to person X. That's fine, it's a gift, but there should be stamp duty payable. Now what if the value of the property is over £325,000? Well, if that's the case, then Charles would have to pay 20% inheritance tax. So if the value of the rental property that he's putting in trust is £500,000, he has to pay £175,000 at 20%. So what can he do? Well, in this case, he's now to Camilla. So he could use Camilla's allowance. So how does he do that? He transfers half the property to her, assuming there's no mortgage, there's no stamp duty to pay. They can both then set up a trust and put in part of the property. He might decide, I'm just going to put half the property in the trust. What he wants to ultimately, in here, he could say, I want the income to go to George, so he can keep it very flexible. So income goes to George, or via his parents, it could be used for whatever purpose, and in the future, if he wants to change it, let's say he has other grandchildren, or doesn't like George anymore, at that point he can change where the income passes to. So this is a very popular question, very popular planning that we're doing at the moment. And it's all legal, it's all vanilla stuff, so the head's not so good.
It's all legal, it is all legal.
Everything's all legal.
Yeah, I was actually just thinking about trusts whilst you're talking about it. It is popular with utilising the income allowances of the grandchildren. When people have, say, 3 or 4 or 5 grandchildren, and you can then have the income passing out of the trust, and you can then say, well, I want it split 5 ways. That's 5 allowances. If your grandchildren are minors and they're not earning any income, they still get their full allowance, which is just wasted most of the time, but you can then split the income, which could be very lucrative, and pay no income tax on it. And because it's flexible, you can manipulate that, so you can actually control it to say, well, I want this grandchild to have the income for now, but actually I'll do 5 years per grandchild, and then as this one gets a bit older, I can then say another 5 years for that grandchild, and you can move it around. You can also, it's also something that we can utilise to almost keep grandchildren on the straight and narrow as well, because you can turn that tap off. If they're not being responsible with the money, then you're in control of how and when that gets distributed to them. The other thing is Rahul's mentioned a few times the 7 years, so you do have to survive the 7 years to get the inheritance tax. It falls away after 7 years. So you're not in a worse position if you gift and you die within the 7 years, but you won't have achieved the inheritance tax relief that you were hoping to achieve. It will still be classed as part of your estate. So we do get people that come to us, and they're 87 years old, and they might live for the 7 years, but none of us know how long we're going to live, but we've all got more chance of living 7 years today than we have tomorrow. And there is that tipping point where you start to say, well, if you're 87, what are the chances? If you're 92, those chances have gone down. And with capital gains tax, you do get an automatic uplift on death, so there's no capital gains tax to pay on death. And the reason for that is that you pay inheritance tax at market value on death. So that is one tiny little gift that the government give us, that you don't pay capital gains tax and inheritance tax on the same asset on death. So in some cases, we would say to clients, keep that asset, because you'll probably die within the 7 years and have to pay 40%, but if you keep it, at least you won't have to pay the CGT allowance and CGT on it, and it's uplifted into your estate, so you don't have to pay both. If you give it and pay the CGT and then die within 7 years, you pay the 24% and the 40%. So worth taking advice, I think, is the highlighting point of that.
And the reason we have this as an example is a grandparents. Now, this actually works from any relationship except for if a parent puts the property to trust for their children. If the children are 18 years or under, you still set it up, but you don't get income tax reliefs, because the income then is treated as though the income belongs to the parents. So to get the income tax benefits, it has to be a non-parent to a minor. But again, you could be a parent who might have a child who's 18 or 19. It's fine. If they're not having any income, it still works.
Case study 4. William and Kate are considering gifting all or part of their main residence to their 3 children, George, Charlotte and Louis, as part of their inheritance tax planning. George has moved out and owns his own house. Charlotte is looking to buy a house, and Louis still lives at home and is working in the family business. So all 3 children are now in very different situations. So what are the considerations? It is really, really common for us to get people that say, I want to put my house into a trust, or I want to give my house to my children. And it's, in most cases, a massive red flag, because from an inheritance tax perspective, if you give something away but you continue to use it, then it's not really a gift. So there is something called a gift with reservation of benefit, sometimes abbreviated to GROB, or the GROB rules. And what that means is, HMRC are too hot on this. If everyone said, I'm giving everything away, but I'm still going to live in the house, keep the Picassos on the wall, and spend the money that I've given away, you haven't actually given it away, and they will tax you on it as if you still own it. Otherwise, it would be all too easy for multimillionaires to give everything away and then still live the life of a multimillionaire. So, with your main residence, if you give it away but you're living in it, then it's a gift with reservation of benefit. The way to get around that is to pay market rent to live in your own house. So, just on a purely emotional side, that's often unpalatable to a lot of people. They've lived in their house for 40 years, they don't want to start paying rent to live in it. So that is one big thing. They also, even if they pay the market rent and they manage to get around the GROB rules, they still have to survive those 7 years. Looking at how this now affects the children, the market rent would be payable to George because he has moved out, so they would have to pay market rent to George to continue to reside in the property. Charlotte is now looking at purchasing a property. She would be a homeowner already, and the new property that she would be buying would be a second home, so she would have the increased rate of SDLT. Also, if there are any benefits for first-time buyers, you lose that if you're already a homeowner. So if you've already got an interest in a property, you're no longer the first-time buyer. Louis, other risks, so not having to pay him rent, he's still living at home at the moment, but potentially if you moved out, that would change. But other things are, all three of them really, if they fall into financial difficulty, or let's say their own relationship falls apart or they go into divorce, then your house is going to form part of those divorce proceedings. If Louis decides that yes, he wants to move out and buy his own house, but in order to do that he wants to realise his interest in your property, that can create the breakdown of the family because he wants to essentially sell your house so that he can then afford to buy his own house. So there's lots of things that come up in this situation where you think it may not achieve what you're trying to achieve in the first place, and even if it does achieve it, it might not be worth it. Care fees come up in this conversation quite a lot. People want to try to avoid being assessed for care home fees. You can potentially avoid some care home fees. There are probably some neater ways of doing it than this if you take some good advice, particularly in relation to your wills if you're a married couple. But then you've probably all heard of what's known as deliberate deprivation of assets. You can be assessed as if you still own the property because you haven't successfully convinced the local authority that you've truly given it away, but then you no longer own the asset to be able to pay the care home fees, so you're charged as if you have the asset, but you don't have the asset to pay the fees. So you've actually put yourself into a substantially worse situation, and it's harder to even sell your interest in the property because you've got one child still living there who's got a protected interest. So, you know, there's lots and lots of considerations, and in a lot of cases when people come to us with this as their high-flying idea that they've come up around the kitchen table, there's actually other suggestions that we can provide to them that might actually work better overall that they might not have considered.
Yeah, and the one thing to say, as we said at the outset, inheritance tax reliefs. If you own a house, you get it, and your estate's under £2 million, and say you leave your house to your descendants, you'll get the residential allowance. So between married couple, that's £350,000. So what's the point? Gifting an asset which is partly tax-free anyway. So if you're going to do it, always keep your 350 because that's your safety net. So what we find mainly when clients we see, we always advise them not to gift their main house, not to gift all their house. The only exceptions sometimes would be they might want to give part of their house if they're living with a child who's actually committed to live with them. Have they, not just have they decorated, got a TV on the wall, but have they committed to stay here, look after mum and dad? In those scenarios then, we understand why the decisions to gift it. Our sole advice is no, don't gift it, but all we can do is say that, talk about the risks and take the emotion out of it. So last case study, pleased to hear. So Charles, fortunately, he's passed away. Sorry, his wife's passed away. Camilla's passed away. He owns 20 rental properties worth £5 million. So it's obviously in Tamworth, not in certain Coalfields. And he's owned them for a long time. What's his options? What can he do to reduce his estate inheritance tax? Again, this is very common as well. What do we do? How do we mitigate the tax? Marry again. Why not? Marry again?
Why?
Why not? Because then he'll get a tax allowance, he'll get a free he can leave everything to his wife, which we can talk about after, or his partner, and if he leaves all his estate to his spouse, it's inheritance tax free. Delay the problem. Find someone a lot younger than him. People do it. They marry people a lot younger than them, and if they set up their wills quite well, then they can potentially bypass that spouse and go to their kids. So marry again is an option. Get another stag. You can look at gifting out of income. So again, this scenario here, Charles has got lots of income. Every pound that Charles is saving, or rather not spending, is paying income tax, and then that money is just rolling up in his estate. So imagine 40% income tax, and then 40% inheritance tax. So what should he do? He could look at least capping his estate by looking at things such as gifting out of income. He might take out some life insurance. He might take out more borrowing. Again, we don't see a huge amount of that happening, but it happens. Some people take equity release out, and then they'll look at gifting the money. He could look to set up trusts, and we mentioned before that if you're gifting £325,000 or less, you're paying your entry charge. But sometimes you're better off thinking, you know, I'll pay the 20% entry charge because it's cheaper than 40%. So some clients do that. You can also just sell up. Property is a hard game, and as we all know, tenants are a nightmare. I don't know how there's so many people in this room to compare, you know. And so you could just sell it, and if he sells up, he'll think, okay, look at the capital gains tax liability. Fine, are there things that can be done to reduce it? But again, compare that to inheritance tax, because once he's got cash, cash is king. There's a lot he can do with the cash. You can look at doing things such as setting up a fan investment company. Now, we won't talk too much about this, but it's something you'll probably hear a lot more about. And in simple terms, a fan investment company is where he sets up a company structure is set up. You have different categories of shares, the right to income, the right to capital, the right to control. And in effect, what Charles can do is, I've got some money here, I can lend that money to the company. The company can buy properties, take financial investments out, and ultimately he still owns the benefit of the loan, and over time he can reduce the loan, he can write off the loan. So lots of things that you can do with cash.
It's more flexible, isn't it? If you've got a property worth £400,000, you'll pay tax if you transfer that property into a trust. But you could sell the property and put £325,000 into the trust without paying inheritance tax, and then retain the rest of it, or give the rest of it away outright. So it does become more flexible and potential to save some more tax if you sell properties. I think it's also worth mentioning that trusts aren't necessarily taxed, they're not tax-free. I think you talked about the high rates of income tax. They still will pay capital gains tax if they hold capital assets. So if properties go into a trust and then the trust sells the property, there's still a CGT charge. And they do still pay inheritance tax. There's different rules that apply depending on the type of trust. The discretionary trusts that I think are probably mostly considered here are on a 10-year regime, so every 10 years they get an inheritance tax charge, but they'll be charged a maximum of 6% inheritance tax. A lot of clients find that difficult because at least with the 40%, it's after they've died, so they never see it being paid, but they then, every 10 years, they get this 6% charge and go, oh, I thought this was supposed to be a tax-free option. It's not tax-free, and I think people should make sure they go into it with their eyes open that it is not tax-free, but as we explain to people when they're complaining about their 6%, if they're looking at preserving assets for their children will see the benefit of not having to pay that 40% at the end of the parent's lifetime. So,
and then the last two slides, just to wrap up quickly, are other considerations as you're looking at estate planning, looking at your wills, make sure it's tax efficient. So if you've got a spouse or civil partner, make sure you use those allowances.
Lasting powers of attorney, those are so important. Again, it's one of those things where I hear a lot of people saying, we need to set up a lasting power of attorney for my mum because she's 85. Well, actually, you should have a lasting power of attorney. Your children who are over the age of 18 should have a lasting power of attorney, because anyone could lose capacity. It's often thought about in the case of things like degenerative diseases and things that might affect you on a slow burn as you get older. But strokes happen, car accidents happen. I always paint the most rosy picture of life because everyone's going to die young and get divorced. But these are the things you have to plan for. And actually, if you've ever tried to phone up Sky or BT and you're not the account holder, they won't speak to you, even if the direct debit's coming out of your bank account. So the fallacy that just because you're married, your spouse has the ability to manage your finances for you or your properties for you if you lose capacity, it's not true. You need a lasting power of attorney to give anyone the legal authority to speak on your behalf. And then when it comes to health and welfare as well, you'll probably see it everywhere in life. More and more red tape all the time. And if you go into care, or you're in an accident, or if you're in hospital, or if you're unconscious, or if you need life support, or you need support, then care homes, doctors, local authority, everyone will be asking who has the legal authority to speak on this person's behalf. And next of kin is a term that's thrown around a lot. It has absolutely no legal standing whatsoever. It just means the seemingly closest person to you. but just because you're someone's next of kin does not make you legally responsible for them. You might be someone's only child, their next of kin, and you might not have spoken to them for 40 years, and their niece or nephew might actually be the person that they would want to speak on their behalf. And the only way to do that is to have your lasting power of attorney. So those are really, really vital documents for everybody over the age of 18 who owns any assets.
Thank you. Any few minutes over, Doctor.
That's fine, that's fine. Any questions, anybody? Has anybody had any experience of lasting power of attorney or trusts or beneficiary of properties?
I know I've certainly seen it with, I know I'm not in the audience, but with some clients that her husband was firefighter, had a stroke whilst on the job, and then didn't have the documents in place. And I think it took her 18 months of rehabilitation for her husband. He's in full-time care, juggling 2 kids that have autism, so needed extra care at home, and it took 18 months to actually get everything sorted and finalised, and that power of attorney retrospectively put in place.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that's implemental and financial.
Sorry, Keith, yeah?
I had a situation where I bought properties years ago, and even when I got married, all my properties were in my name. I got married, and even our marriage was in my name, even though we were together at the time. We received the mortgage, and I was under the impression that if anything happened to me, it all goes to her. You know, that wasn't the case.
Is that not right?
And unfortunately, she did actually die. But if I'd have died first, she'd have had an absolute nightmare. The tax, and she lost her own probably. The amount, 40% of everything I owned would have gone in tax. It's been a nightmare for her. She wouldn't even know where to start. But,
If you don't have a will, then the intestacy rules will kick in. And the intestacy rules are one rule which is designed to apply to absolutely everybody that doesn't have a will. And just in this room there will be as many different family scenarios and financial situations as there are people. So the fact that there's one set of rules that is designed to apply doesn't work. And so there's a cap on what your spouse will inherit. They'll get your personal chattels and a specific legacy of, is it 322 now? £322,000. Everything else would be split, half to the spouse on trust and half to the children, which means that if your house is worth £500,000, then your spouse is only going to take a proportion of that and the children are going to inherit. And if your children are under 18, then at the point at which they're 18, then that ownership, they're going to have their names put on the land registry title, and the control that your spouse is going to have is going to be massively different. If your spouse is trying to raise young children and a huge amount of the assets don't belong to them, then they're massively curtailed in their own lifestyle, the lifestyle they can provide for the children. They're very limited in what they can do with the children's money that's just being held for them until they turn 18, and then those children can go off at 18 and do whatever they like with it and blow the lot if they want to. So the intestacy rules aren't to be relied upon.
I think people under the illusion that once they've made a will, they're transferring, giving, even though they've made a will, say what they want doing. It ain't as simple as that.
No.
I'll tell you something, it's been a nightmare when we get the finances sorted out.
I won't get too high on my hobby horse with wills, but you do have to be really careful, because this is a document that deals with everything you own in the entire world for the benefit of the people that you care most about in the entire world. And people want to try to do it as cheap and cheerful with as limited input as possible. You'd spend more time and money on your kitchen floor than you would on your will, you know, because you can see the benefits of it. But actually, free wills can work. A will from W.H. Smith's can work. A will that you write on the back of an envelope can work. But they're not guaranteed, and they certainly aren't appropriate in all circumstances. And in many cases, paying for some decent advice can not only save you money in the long run, a huge amount of tax for your family potentially, and hassle. In many cases, the will that looks like this creates more turmoil and problems than the will that's 15 pages long, because the will that's 15 pages long has thought about all of this and dealt with it appropriately. This will has dealt with absolutely nothing. It's just put the right amount of words on a piece of paper to be valid. So that's my lecture on wills. But, you know, cheap does not always mean that you somehow beat the system.
I've had to use Robertson's and save me thousands. Thousands.
We're worth every penny, aren't we?
Thank you both.